If you're enjoying these stories, you can support us on Patreon. There are several unique stories over there that I haven't uploaded to YouTube. Please consider supporting me on Patreon if you can. Now, let's get into the story. My friend Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair, his long, thin legs stretched out toward the hearth, where a sea-coal fire crackled with a fitful blue flame. For hours he had been silent, his hawkish profile outlined against the warm glow, his fingers drumming a light irregular tattoo upon the armrest of his chair. On the low table beside him lay his chemical apparatus, a rack of test tubes, a glass retort, and a small burner, where he had been analysing some coal tar derivatives with his customary intense absorption. "You see, Watson," he said suddenly, breaking a silence of nearly 2 hours, "the human mind is like a small, empty attic, and a man must stock it with such furniture as he chooses. The fool takes in all the lumber of every sort, so that the knowledge which might be useful to him gets crowded out. It is a mistake to think that our little room has elastic walls." "I was not aware," I replied, looking up from my medical journal, "that your own attic was in any danger of overcrowding. At the moment, Watson, it is singularly empty. The criminal classes of this metropolis have fallen into a state of most distressing mediocrity. With the exception of a minor forgery in Peckham and a rather clumsy burglary in Kensington, my monograph on the variations of tobacco ash remains my sole intellectual solace. I pine for something that tests the mettle of our analytical methods." He had hardly finished speaking when the heavy tread of our landlady, Mrs. Hudson, was heard upon the stair. A moment later she ushered into the room a man of such extraordinary proportions that he seemed to fill the doorway by his sheer physical presence. Our visitor was a giant of a man, standing well over 6 feet 3 inches in his boots, with a chest that resembled a stout oaken cask. He wore a heavy, rough-spun coat of pilot cloth, which sat awkwardly upon his massive shoulders, and held a bowler hat in hands that were thick, scarred, and broad as shovels. Yet, despite his formidable physique, his countenance was remarkably gentle. He had wide-set, honest blue eyes, a square chin that lacked any trace of malice, and a look of such profound, childlike bewilderment that my professional sympathies were instantly aroused. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, in a voice that was a deep, resonant baritone, though it trembled with a nervousness that seemed ill-suited to his frame. "I am indeed," Holmes replied, rising and gesturing to a sturdy mahogany chair, "and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. Pray seat yourself, sir. I perceive by the calluses upon your palms and the peculiar development of your trapezius muscles that you are a gentleman who makes his living by feats of physical strength, and by the yellow clay upon the instep of your boots that you have recently come from the riverside works of Hammersmith." Our visitor stared in open-mouthed astonishment. "By George, Mr. Holmes, you speak the truth. I am Jonathan Rance, though the public knows me as Vigor, the Hammersmith wonder." "But how you knew?" "It is my business to know what others merely see," Holmes said with a faint smile. "But tell us, Mr. Rance, what brings a man of your extraordinary power to our quiet rooms? It is not often that the strongest man in London stands in need of assistance from a sedentary investigator." "It is because they say I am a murderer, sir," cried the giant, his great hands clenching until the knuckles went white. "They say I crushed the life out of Ebenezer Croft with my bare hands. The police have me on bail, and if I cannot prove my innocence, I shall hang by the neck until I am dead. And before God, Mr. Holmes, I never laid a violent finger upon him." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes shining with that sudden intense interest which always signalled the awakening of his formidable faculties. "Ebenezer Croft," he mused. "The name is not unknown to me. If I remember correctly, he was your chief rival in the music halls, a fellow strongman who performed under the title of the Iron Titan of the North." "He was, sir," Rance said, nodding gloomily. "And a bitter, envious man he was. But I did not hate him, Mr. Holmes. I swear it. There was room enough in London for both of us." "Tell us your story from the beginning," said Holmes, settling back into his chair and closing his eyes, his fingertips joined in his characteristic attitude of contemplation. "Omit no detail, however trivial it may seem. In the web of human affairs, it is often the smallest thread that holds the key to the entire pattern. It began 3 days ago on Tuesday afternoon," the strong man began, his deep voice filling the quiet room. "I was engaged to perform my signature feat of strength upon the old coal pier at Hammersmith. It is a public exhibition, Mr. Holmes, designed to draw the crowds for the local merchants. My performance consists of bending a massive iron anchor shaft, 3 inches in diameter, across my shoulders, and then lifting a wooden platform upon which 6 grown men stand. The crowd was large. Some 300 people had gathered on the pier and along the river wall. The weather was foul, much like tonight, with a nasty chop on the river and a mist that clung to the water. I had just completed my first feat, the bending of the anchor shaft, and was preparing for the platform lift when a great shouting arose from the slipway directly beneath the pier. 2 mudlarks, young boys who searched the river banks for coal and copper, had found something caught in the wooden pilings of the pier. The tide was ebbing, you see, and as the water receded, it left behind a grisly thing. It was the body of Ebenezer Croft. "And what was the condition of the body?" Holmes asked, his eyes still closed. "It was terrible, sir," Rance said, shuddering. "He was dressed in rough woolens, but his chest was completely caved in. It looked as though a wagon with a 5-ton load had been driven clean over him. His ribs were shattered to splinters, and there was a great blue and purple bruising across his breast. The local apothecary, who was called to the scene, said that only a force of immense crushing power could have inflicted such injuries." "I see," said Holmes. "And why did the suspicion fall so heavily upon you?" "Because of what had happened the night before, Mr. Holmes," Rance explained, his face flushing with embarrassment. "Croft and I had a public dispute at the 3 Jolly Gardeners, a public house near the river. He had been drinking heavily, and he began to accuse me of using hollow weights and trick anchors. He called me a fraud and a charlatan. I'm a patient man, sir, but my reputation is my livelihood. I stood up and told him that if he did not hold his tongue, I would snap him like a dry twig. I even took an iron poker from the hearth and twisted it into a knot before his eyes to show him what I could do. There were 50 men in the bar who heard me threat him, Mr. Holmes, and when he was found the very next day within 50 yards of where I was performing, with his ribs crushed into his lungs, Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard was called. He took one look at the body, remembered our quarrel, and arrested me on suspicion of murder. They have let me out on a £500 bail, which my manager provided, but they are watching me night and day. If I cannot show how Ebenezer Croft met his death, I am a ruined man." Holmes opened his eyes and leaned forward. Was there any sign of water in his lungs? Had he drowned? The apothecary said not, sir. He said Croft was dead before he ever entered the water, or at least that he had not died of drowning. His lungs were full of blood from his shattered ribs, but there was no river water in them. An interesting point, Holmes murmured. And where is the body now? It lies at the Hammersmith parish mortuary, awaiting the coroner's inquest tomorrow morning. Holmes rose from his chair with a sudden, elastic energy. "Watson," he said, "our evening's occupation is laid out for us. We must examine this poor relic of humanity before the coroner's assistants begin their clumsy work. Mr. Rance, you have done well to come to us. Return to your lodgings, remain quiet, and do not attempt to leave the district. I cannot promise you a solution, but I can assure you that we shall find the truth, wherever it may lead." Within half an hour, Holmes and I were seated in a hansom cab, rattling through the wet, greasy streets of West London. The fog had grown even thicker, casting a yellow halo around each gas lamp and turning the passing carriages into ghostly silhouettes. "What do you make of it, Watson?" Holmes asked as he lit a cigarette and leaned back in the cab. "It is a dark business," I admitted. "The physical strength required to crush a man's thoracic cage in such a fashion is almost superhuman. Yet we know that Jonathan Rance possesses precisely that strength. His public threat, the proximity of the body to his performance, and their known rivalry form a damning chain of circumstantial evidence." "Circumstantial evidence is a very tricky thing," Holmes remarked, gazing out into the gloom. "It may seem to point very straight to one thing, but if you shift your own point of view a little, you may find it pointing in an equally uncompromising manner to something entirely different. Consider the nature of the injuries. A man who is crushed by another's grasp, even the grasp of a giant like Vigor, will almost invariably show the marks of fingers, the bruising of localized pressure, or the signs of a violent struggle. Let us see if our inspection of the body bears out Lestrade's simplistic theory. We arrived at the Hammersmith parish mortuary, a grim, stone-fronted building situated near the riverbank. Holmes's credentials, combined with my own professional status, readily secured us admission from the elderly keeper in charge. We were ushered into a cold, whitewashed room where, under the flickering light of a gas bracket, a long table stood covered with a damp canvas sheet. Holmes stepped forward and drew back the sheet, revealing the mortal remains of Ebenezer Croft. He had been a man of formidable build, though shorter than Vigor, with the thick, knotted arms and deep chest of a professional lifter. His face, even in death, bore a sullen, combative expression, though his features were distorted by a strange, cyanotic, bluish tint. I stepped closer to examine the chest, and a cry of professional astonishment escaped my lips. "Good heavens, Holmes!" I exclaimed. "The injury is indeed extraordinary. The sternum is depressed, and the ribs on both sides are fractured in a uniform circular pattern. It is as if some great circular band had been tightened around his chest until the bones collapsed." "Precisely so," Holmes said, his eyes scanning the body with intense concentration. He had produced a pocket magnifying glass and was examining the dead man's neck and wrists. "Observe, Watson, there are no marks of fingers upon the throat, nor any bruising on the arms, such as one would expect from a struggle. But look at this." He pointed with his lens to the skin of the neck. There was a distinct, deep, circular ring of a dark, greasy substance clinging to the flesh just above the collarbone. A similar, though smaller, ring of the same black grease was visible around both wrists. "What do you make of that, Watson?" Holmes asked. "It looks like oil," I said, leaning closer. "A heavy mineral grease, such as is used for lubricating heavy machinery." "Quite so. And observe the skin itself. It is not merely bruised. It is swollen and shows signs of severe barotrauma, the rupturing of small capillaries beneath the surface, such as occurs when a man is subjected to a sudden, violent change in atmospheric pressure. Note the hemorrhaging in the conjunctiva of the eyes and the slight bloody discharge from the ears. These are not the symptoms of a physical assault by a strongman, Watson. They are the classic signs of a sudden, catastrophic pressure differential." "But how could such a thing occur on a London pier?" I asked, bewildered. "That is the problem which we must solve," Holmes replied, his eyes gleaming with excitement. He carefully scraped a small portion of the black grease from the victim's neck into a glass vial, which he sealed and placed in his pocket. He then examined the soles of the dead man's feet. They were clean, save for a few fragments of green riverweed and a peculiar, fine grey sand that did not resemble the common mud of the Thames. "We have seen enough here," Holmes said, drawing the sheet back over the tragic figure. "Let us now visit the scene of the discovery. The tide must be low by now, and the mud of the Thames has a great deal to tell those who know how to read its pages." We walked down to the Hammersmith pier, which loomed dark and silent in the fog. The tide had indeed receded, exposing a wide, glittering stretch of black mud that sloped down to the dark, sullen waters of the river. The air was cold and filled with the pungent, salty smell of decaying vegetation and river silt. Holmes produced his electric pocket lamp, casting a sharp, narrow beam of white light across the mud. "The body was found caught in the pilings of this slipway," he muttered, stepping carefully onto the slippery timbers. "Let us see what the mud can show us." He scrambled down the side of the pier with an agility that defied his sedentary habits. I followed him as best I could, our boots sinking deep into the cold muck. For several minutes Holmes moved slowly along the foreshore, his lamp held close to the ground, his eyes scanning every inch of the surface. "Ah!" he cried suddenly. "Watson, look here!" I hurried to his side. In the light of his lamp I saw a series of deep, circular depressions in the mud. They were spaced at regular intervals, suggesting the footprints of some colossal creature, but they were twice the size of any human boot and completely round, with no distinction between heel and toe. Each impression was deep enough to hold several inches of water. "What in the world is it?" I gasped. "A horse? A beast?" "No beast, Watson," Holmes said, his voice tense with excitement. "A horse has hooves and its gait is entirely different. These are the tracks of a biped, but one of immense weight. See how deeply they have sunk into the clay, far deeper than our own footprints or indeed those of any ordinary man. And look at the stride. It is short, heavy, and awkward." He followed the tracks with his light. They led from the deep-water channel of the river up the sloping mudbank toward an old, dilapidated barge yard that stood some 50 yards from the pier. The yard was surrounded by a rusting iron fence, and a sagging wooden gate hung open on its hinges. "The tracks lead directly to that yard," Holmes observed. "Let us see what secrets are kept behind those rusty bars." We picked our way through the mud and entered the yard. It was a desolate place, littered with the rotting timbers of old barges, rusted iron chains, and piles of discarded machinery. In the centre of the yard stood a long, low brick building with a corrugated iron roof. A fading painted sign above the door read, "The London Pneumatic Salvage Company." Holmes tried the door, but it was locked with a heavy padlock. Undeterred, he shone his light through one of the dirty, cracked window panes. The interior of the building was filled with strange industrial apparatus, air compressors, heavy rubber hoses, copper helmets, and several large metallic cylinders. "An engineering firm," I remarked, "but it appears to have been abandoned for some time." "Abandoned, yes, but not unused," Holmes whispered. He pointed his light toward the floor, just inside the window. There, clearly visible in the dust, were the same circular, heavy footprints we had seen in the mud outside. And beside them lay a dark, greasy smear that matched the substance we had found upon the victim's neck. "We are on the verge of a very singular discovery, Watson," Holmes said, "but we must proceed with caution. Let us return to Baker Street. I have some chemical analysis to perform, and we must make some inquiries regarding the history of this London Pneumatic Salvage Company. I think a telegram to our friend Lestrade may also be in order, to ensure he does not make a premature arrest which he would deeply regret." By the time we returned to our rooms, the clock had struck midnight. Holmes went straight to his chemical corner, where he busied himself with his reagents and test tubes. I sat by the fire, my mind turning over the inexplicable elements of the case. How could Ebenezer Croft, a man of exceptional physical strength, have met his death by a force that crushed his chest like an eggshell? What was the meaning of the heavy, circular footprints in the river mud? And what connection did they have with the abandoned salvage yard? "The chemistry is simple enough, Watson," Holmes said, stepping away from his table and wiping his hands on a cloth. "The black grease upon the victim's neck and wrists is a mixture of paraffin, tallow, and heavy mineral oil thickened with graphite. It is a compound precisely formulated to seal joints against high-pressure water. It is, in fact, the packing grease used in heavy marine engineering." "But what of the circular wounds?" I asked. "And the barotrauma?" "They are the results of a sudden catastrophic change in pressure. But to understand how that occurred, we must understand the nature of the salvage company. I have consulted my index of industrial firms. The London Pneumatic Salvage Company was founded 3 years ago by a brilliant but eccentric engineer named Orville Vance. His purpose was to develop a new form of deep-sea diving dress that would allow divers to descend to depths hitherto unreached by man." "A diving suit?" I exclaimed. "Precisely. The traditional diving dress, with its canvas suit and copper helmet, is limited by the pressure of the water. As the diver descends, the water pressure increases, and the air supplied to him must be at an equal pressure to prevent his chest from being crushed. If the air supply fails, or if there is a sudden drop in pressure within the helmet, the weight of the water above will instantly crush the diver's body into his own helmet, a terrible phenomenon known to divers as the squeeze." "Good heavens, Holmes," I cried, "is that what happened to Croft?" "It is the only explanation that fits the physical facts, Watson. But Vance's invention was designed to prevent this very danger. He constructed a rigid armoured diving suit, a pneumatic Titan, made of heavy bronze and steel plates with articulated joints sealed with high-pressure packing grease. Because the suit was rigid, the diver inside remained at normal atmospheric pressure, regardless of the depth of the water. He was, in effect, inside a small, mobile submarine. "And where is this suit now?" I asked. "That is what we must ask Mr. Orville Vance himself," Holmes replied. "I have found his address in the directory. He lives in a modest villa in Putney. We shall pay him a visit first thing in the morning." The next morning dawned cold and clear, the storm having passed, leaving the streets of London washed clean and glittering in the pale autumn sunlight. Holmes and I took an early train to Putney, where we found the residence of Mr. Orville Vance. He was a thin, scholarly-looking man of about 50, with wild grey hair, nervous, watery eyes, and a look of profound distress. His hands trembled as he showed us into his study, which was littered with blueprints, mechanical drawings, and small brass models of diving equipment. "Yes, gentlemen," Vance said in response to Holmes's opening inquiry. "It is true. My company is bankrupt and my life's work is ruined. The pneumatic Titan was my masterpiece. It would have revolutionized deep-sea salvage. But I could not find the capital to continue my experiments, and the bank foreclosed upon my warehouse 3 months ago." "And what became of the prototype suit?" Holmes asked, his eyes fixed intently upon the engineer. Vance's face turned pale. "It was stolen, Mr. Holmes, stolen from the warehouse just 4 days ago. I went there to inspect the stock before the auctioneers arrived, and I found the back door forced and the prototype gone. It is a massive thing, weighing nearly 300 weight, and would require several men or a stout block and tackle to move it. I reported the theft to the local police, but they treated it as a minor matter of scrap metal theft." "And did anyone else know of the suit's capabilities?" Holmes inquired. "Only one man, besides myself, knew its full potential," Vance said bitterly. "Ebenezer Croft. He was a diver before he became a music hall strongman. He had worked for me during the early trials of the suit, and he knew that I had built it to withstand the pressure of over 200 feet of water. He also knew that it was stored in the Hammersmith warehouse." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes bright with victory. "And did Croft know of any specific treasure or wreck that lay within reach of the suit?" "Why, yes," Vance replied, looking surprised. "The wreck of the city of Ghent. She was an iron-hulled bullion barge that sank in the Hammersmith bend of the Thames 20 years ago during a great gale. She was carrying £10,000 in gold sovereigns, which were never recovered because of the treacherous currents and the depth of the silt. Croft had always insisted that with my suit a man could walk along the riverbed, find the wreck in the dark, and retrieve the gold without anyone being the wiser." "We have our motive, Watson," Holmes cried, rising from his chair. Croft, desperate for money and envious of Vance's success, decided to make a clandestine attempt upon the wreck of the city of Ghent. He stole the prototype suit, dragged it to the old barge yard, and prepared to descend into the murky waters of the Thames. But something went catastrophically wrong. "But what could have caused his injuries, Mr. Holmes?" Vance asked, his voice shaking. "The suit was designed to protect him from the pressure, not to crush him." "Your suit utilized an experimental pressure valve to regulate the internal air supply and exhaust, did it not?" Holmes asked. "Yes," Vance admitted. "It was an automatic, self-regulating valve. But it was a prototype, and I had warned Croft during the trials that it was prone to jamming if it became fouled with sand or river silt. If the exhaust valve were to jam open while the air pump was operating, or if the main pressure seal were to fail suddenly, the internal pressure would drop instantly to 0, Holmes finished, while the external water pressure, even at 40 feet, would be several tons. The soft, flexible leather joints of the suit, which were positioned at the chest and limbs to allow movement, would be forced inward with the power of a hydraulic press. The diver would be crushed to death inside his own metal shell. "My God!" Vance whispered, burying his face in his hands. "It is too horrible to contemplate." "We must prove this theory beyond all doubt," Holmes said. "Lestrade has the strong man in custody, and only a scientific demonstration will convince him of the truth. Mr. Vance, I must ask you to accompany us to the barge yard. We have a dark and dangerous task before us, but it is the only way to save an innocent man from the gallows." By mid-afternoon we had assembled at the old barge yard of the London Pneumatic Salvage Company. Holmes had summoned Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, who arrived with 2 of his officers, looking thoroughly sceptical. "It is all very well, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade said, his hands in his pockets as he stood in the damp, draughty warehouse. "You have your theories about diving suits and pressure valves, but we have a dead man with his ribs broken by brute force, and we have a professional strongman who threatened to do that very thing to him only 24 hours before. In the eyes of the law, that is a straight, simple case of murder." "My dear Lestrade," Holmes said, with a touch of impatience, "the law is often blind, but science is not. If you will have your men assist us, we shall show you how Ebenezer Croft really met his end." Under Holmes's direction, we searched the deep water slipway of the barge yard. Using a heavy iron drag hook, which we cast from the end of the jetty, we swept the muddy bottom of the channel. After several unsuccessful attempts, the hook caught upon something heavy and immovable. "Heave, Watson! Heave, Lestrade!" Holmes cried. With our combined strength we pulled upon the wet hemp rope. Slowly, laboriously, a great dark object rose from the yellow-brown waters of the Thames. It broke the surface with a heavy splash. A monstrous, grotesque figure of bronze and steel, covered in green riverweed and black mud. It was the pneumatic Titan. We hauled the massive suit onto the wooden slipway. It was a terrifying apparatus, resembling a medieval suit of armour combined with a modern steam boiler. The heavy bronze helmet was bolted to a thick steel breastplate, and the limbs were constructed of articulated metal plates connected by thick oily leather joints. Holmes knelt beside the suit and began to examine it with his pocket lens. "Observe, Lestrade," he said, pointing to the chest plate. "The leather seal at the breast is completely ruptured, torn inward by some immense force. And look at this valve at the back of the helmet." He pointed to a small brass mechanism that was choked with fine grey sand, the very sand we had found upon the soles of the victim's feet. "The exhaust valve is jammed open," Holmes explained. "Croft must have descended into the deep channel of the river near the bend where the bullion barge lies. As he walked along the bottom, his heavy metal boots stirred up the deep silt. The fine sand entered the delicate mechanism of the prototype valve and jammed it. With the valve stuck open, the compressed air supplied from his hand pump on the jetty escaped into the water. The internal pressure of the suit dropped instantly. The weight of the water above him, which at 50 feet is nearly 25 pounds per square inch, pressed upon the flexible leather joints of his chest. It was a force of several tons, Lestrade. It crushed his ribs as if they were dry twigs, killing him instantly. In his dying convulsions, or perhaps through the action of the currents, the air pipe was severed. The suit, being heavy, remained on the riverbed, but Croft's body, which had been partially compressed, was forced out through the ruptured leather breast joint by the remaining air pressure in his boots, and washed up under the pier by the rising tide. Lestrade looked at the monstrous suit, his face pale with a sudden dawning comprehension. "It is a plausible theory, Mr. Holmes, but how can you prove it? A jury will want more than theories to clear a man like Vigor." "We shall prove it by direct demonstration," Holmes replied. He turned to Orville Vance, who had brought a small, hand-operated hydraulic pressure pump from his laboratory. We placed a stout, hollow leather dummy, such as Vance used for testing his suits, inside the armoured dress, sealing the joints as best we could. Holmes then connected the pressure pump to the suit's water intake. "Now, Lestrade," Holmes said, his hand upon the lever of the pump, "observe the pressure gauge. We shall simulate the pressure of 40 feet of water, approximately 2 atmospheres. At normal operation, the internal pressure remains balanced. But now—" Holmes reached down and deliberately jammed the exhaust valve open with a metal pin, representing the action of the sand. He then began to pump. For a moment there was a tense, heavy silence in the warehouse, broken only by the rhythmic clanking of the pump. The pressure gauge needle crept slowly upward. Suddenly there was a sharp metallic ping, followed by a terrifying hollow thud. The thick leather joints at the chest of the suit collapsed inward with a violent, explosive force, folding the heavy leather like paper and crushing the wooden frame of the dummy inside with a loud, splintering crash. Lestrade took a step back, his eyes wide with horror. "My God, Holmes!" he gasped. "It is like a giant hand had squeezed it." "Precisely," Holmes said, releasing the pressure valve. "The hand of nature, Lestrade. A force far greater than that of any human strongman, even Vigor, the Hammersmith wonder. Jonathan Rance could no more have inflicted these injuries than he could have lifted the dome of St. Paul's. Ebenezer Croft was the victim of his own greed and a faulty piece of engineering." It was late that evening when we returned to Baker Street. The fire had been rebuilt, and a hot supper of oysters and cold pheasant awaited us upon the sideboard. Jonathan Rance had been released from custody that afternoon, his innocence established beyond all shadow of doubt. He had wept like a child as he thanked Holmes, offering him his entire savings, which Holmes, with his customary indifference to wealth, had declined, accepting only a modest fee to cover our expenses. "It has been a most instructive day, Watson," Holmes said, as he poured himself a glass of port and settled back into his armchair. "It shows how easily the human mind can be led astray by a preconceived idea." Lestrade saw a man with crushed ribs and a rival with great physical strength, and he looked no further. He failed to ask himself why a man who had been hugged to death should show the signs of barotrauma and have his collarbone marked with engineering grease. "It is a wonderful thing, Holmes," I said, looking at my friend with admiration. "You have saved a gentle giant from a terrible fate, and you have cleared up a mystery that would have baffled the entire police force of this country." "The credit belongs to the laws of physics, Watson," Holmes said with a quiet smile, "and perhaps to a small bottle of mineral oil and a few grains of Thames sand. But let us speak of it no more. The case is closed, the Hammersmith wonder is free to bend his anchors once again, and we have a long winter before us. Pass me my violin, if you please, and let us see if we can find in the harmonies of Mendelssohn some relief from the drab and dusty realities of our daily existence. Thank you for watching. Before you go, don't forget to check out our Patreon.